questions?
Good afternoon, Mr. Kennedy. Do you have any response to the special counsel being appointed yesterday in the Hunter Biden probe?
No, I'm leaving the court cases to the courts.
Is Woody Harrelson now a supporter of yours?
What?
Is Woody Harrelson now a supporter of yours?
I hope so. I hope so. My wife did the podcast with him, and she gave him the hat at the beginning of the podcast. And she said, well, do you want to take it off now that we're doing it? And he said no. So, but you know, he's very hard to get on his cell phone. He doesn't use cell phones. I want to just show you guys. I don't know if any of you were over there when I was talking, but one of the things that is, to me, a big concern, the biggest concern, well, one of the largest concerns in Iowa, are these pipelines that are being proposed by Bruce Ratzetter and by BlackRock and Smithfield. And these pipelines are one of the biggest boondoggles I've ever seen. So this is $173 billion over a 10-year period to the oil industry and to big agriculture. It will do nothing for climate change. And in fact, it will make carbon emissions worse, almost certainly. The reason for that is these pipelines they're going to take ethanol, carbon from ethanol plants. They're going to collect them and they're sending them up to supposedly to a dump site, a deep well injection site in North Dakota, but it's right next to the Bakken fields. So North Dakota has already turned them down and said you cannot build the deep well injection site. But nevertheless, the Iowa Utility Board is now about to approve eminent domain for these pipelines to condemn land in this state, to take land from private farmers who do not want to sell their land, to put this pipeline through their property. 45 of the 56 counties through which it runs have protested to the Iowa Utility Board. 80% of the people in this state do not want this to happen. But the people who are building these pipelines have abused the campaign finance system. And for example, one of the owners has contributed $1.6 million to leading Republicans in the state, including the governor, $163,000 to the governor. And she then appointed the two members of the utility board. The old chairman of the utility board delayed the project. They are now fast-tracking it. And this is going to be pushed through, and it makes no sense. The only people, this is going to rob the taxpayer of $173 billion, and it's going to transfer that money to the oil industry. And it's clear that what they really want these pipelines for is to pressure the oil to scour the last oil in the wells at the Bakken crude site. It has nothing to do with helping climate. In fact, the previous pipe, which was the guinea pig pipe, at ADM built in Illinois, ended up not working, and it has removed less than 3% of ADM's carbon. So they're now doing something that has not been done before. We have a Fifth Amendment in this country, which says that if you're going to take somebody's private property, the government is going to take private property, it has to first provide due process and just compensation. And it can only take that property for a public interest. In this case, this property is being taken for a private interest to make an extraordinarily profitable transfer of wealth from the American taxpayer to these very, very wealthy oil companies and ethanol companies. And if they can get away with this, we've essentially lost the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, because now, from now on, any wealthy businessman who has a project that they want can now go to the government and get eminent domain to condemn your property or your property in order to build something that has a dubious, if any, public benefit. So I just want to start by saying that, and again, I'm happy to answer any kind of questions.
Mr. Ken, a quick question. Your message seems to be resonating with the GOP voters I've been talking to in Iowa. Let's say a Republican does win in 2024. Would you serve on a Republican administration?
I'm not going to. I'm not going to. I've been repeatedly asked whether I would be, whether I'd consider being Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, and I would not.
But in any GOP administration, would
I
you
don't-
serve cabinet, anything like that?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Do you have a response? Iowa Democratic Party Chair Rita Hart was on Iowa Press this week and said that she had concerns about comments you made that she felt were anti-Semitic.
About what?
About comments that you've made that she felt were.
Yeah, I've never made an anti-Semitic comment in my life. In fact, I'm also being, by the far left, I'm also, and by the mainstream media, I'm also at the same time being accused of being a Zionist. So, in fact, I'm debating Matt Blumenthal in a couple of weeks because he's complaining that I'm a Zionist. So it's pretty hard to justify, it's pretty hard to reconcile somebody being an anti-Semite and a Zionist. I've never made any anti-Semitic. I've never made any anti-Semitic, even a phrase in my entire life.
The Democratic National Committee has voted to remove Iowa from the early window of states. How competitive do you feel you'll need to be in Iowa to win in the caucus against Joe Biden?
Well, I'm going to have to be competitive enough to beat him.
Mr. Kennedy, Dr. Cornel West was just on the Breakfast Club. When he was asked about you and your family, he said he loves you guys, but he did say that your family put FBI surveillance on Dr. Martin Luther King and kept track of it. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's true. And my uncle, and you know, the history of it is that J. Edgar Hoover believed that there was that Martin Luther King was being influenced by communists on his staff, and that he went to my father, who was then Attorney General, and he asked to wiretap him. And my father reluctantly agreed, but then President Kennedy famously took Martin Luther King for a walk in the Rose Garden and told him that he was being bugged.
Mr. Kennedy, would you support the 2024 Democratic nominee if it's not
And by the way, I'm very happy that Cornel West is running. Cornel West has been very, very good on the Ukraine war, and I think he understands, he has the same concerns that I do about the middle class of this country being strip-mined by big corporations of their equity and their wealth.
What do you say to Democrats that are saying that he's spoiled?
Well, I'm saying that we live in a democracy. We're not a Soviet state where the party gets to pick the nominee. We're supposed to be living in a democracy, and we're living at a period in history. There's many, many Americans who believe that the system is rigged against them. Not only the whole economic system, the political system, but also the electoral system. I think it's really important today that both political parties make every effort they can to make sure that these elections are models of a democratic process. That that there are candidates who are debating, that there are candidates who are doing town halls, retail politics, visiting the nail salons, visiting the farms, visiting the barber shops, visiting the gas stations and the diners, and listening to Americans rather than just listening to their funders. Oh, I think that's critical, and the more people are running, the better it is for American democracy. So I welcome Cornel West to the race, and I'm very grateful that he's delivering the kind of important messages that he's talking about.
Mr. Kennedy, would you support the 2024 Democratic nominee if it's not yourself?
I don't know who it's going to be, so I wouldn't answer that question, and I expect to be the nominee.
Would you consider running as an independent?
No, probably not.
You've talked about how the Department of Homeland Security denied you Secret Service protection. I'm just wondering, have you been able to employ any type of private security contractor or anything like that at this point?
Well, I'm not going to tell you my security arrangements for obvious reasons, but as far as we can tell, I'm the first candidate in history to be denied Secret Service protection on request. My uncle got Secret Service protection. Teddy got Secret Service protection 441 days out, and he wasn't even running. So President Carter, who he was running against, there was a great personal antipathy between them. And nevertheless, he provided him Secret Service protection. John McCain got it 551 days out. Obama got it 551 days out. Literally, Jesse Jackson, Shirley Chisholm, you go all the way back, John McCain. All of them were given Secret Service protection much farther out than I requested it. Oh, the excuse that the White House has given that it's not available until 120 days out is just specious, it's dishonest, it's not true.
Mr. Kennedy, you're running to unseat a Democrat, you're running as a Democrat. My question to you is, what's your biggest issue with President Biden's leadership?
The censorship, the war, and putting neocons, war-mongering neocons in front of in charge of our foreign policy, and putting Wall Street in charge of our domestic policy and our economy.
So what would you do differently?
I would do everything differently. I would negotiate with the Russians, which is what they've wanted to do from day one. The Russians signed a peace agreement in March of 2022, which we just found out about, and Zelensky initialed it. And the Russians were actually withdrawing their troops in March of 2022 and April of 2022. And President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Kiev to blow up that agreement. And since then, 135,000 kids, Ukrainian kids, have died, and 50,000 Russian kids. My son went over to Ukraine and fought in the Kharkiv offensive. He was a machine gunner in a special forces unit. And so, I'm deeply concerned with the welfare of the people in Ukraine. I admire their valor. They died unnecessarily to fulfill an ambition of the United States, which was to use Ukraine in a proxy war with Russia. In fact, when President Biden was asked about what the purpose of the war was, he said regime change in Russia. When Lloyd Austin, his Secretary of Defense, was asked in April 2022, right after they blew up the agreement, why are we in Ukraine? He said to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. That is not about Ukrainian freedom. It is about using Ukraine in a proxy war, in a geopolitical dispute between two great powers.
Are you saying that it's the United States' fault that Russia invaded Ukraine?
No, I'm not. I'm not making any excuse for Vladimir Putin. His invasion was illegal, it was brutal, and he had other options. But did we deliberately provoke the action? Yes, we did. Again and again and again, we would not allow Zelensky to sign the Minsk Accords in 2019. Zelensky ran as the peace candidate. He's a comedian. He's an actor, which I'm not disparaging because that's what my wife does. But he had never been in politics. But he won with 70% of the vote. Why? Because he ran promising that he would sign the Minsk Accords, which were already agreed to by Russia, by France, and by Germany. And then the United States, our White House, went over there and we would not let him sign. If we had let him sign, this war would have never happened and all those kids would be alive today.
Sir, there were two different Minsk Accords, and you've talked in the past about how you would use that as a structure for having peace. But obviously it wasn't able to prevent the war initially. I'm just wondering, why do you think that the Minsk Accords would be able to stop it?
I'm not arguing that the Minsk Accords today would still work. I don't think the Russians would agree to the Minsk Accords today, but the Minsk Accords didn't work before because we wouldn't let them work. The Russians were going to let them work. Germany was going to. France and Zelensky was going to. So they worked for everybody except for the neocons in the White House who wanted this war.
What's your path to peace, sir? What would you do to end this war?
I would negotiate with the Russians.
What would that include? Would you be willing
Well,
to say
I wouldn't tell you. You keep asking me questions that it would be crazy for me to answer. I negotiate for a living. I've settled hundreds of lawsuits. You never tell them what you're going to negotiate for before you negotiate. So I would say my answer to that is strategic ambiguity.
Mr. Kennedy, on Ukraine, other candidates have gone there recently. Would you consider a visit to Ukraine?
Yeah, I would love to go to Ukraine.
Would you even press
Mr. Kennedy,
I-
our president says we're closer to nuclear war now than ever before since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Would you support a policy of no first use of nukes?
Yeah, well, I would, but here's the thing. What you're saying is really important because the Russians, we are provoking. Not only have we made the worst geopolitical mistake, which is to push the Russians into an embrace of China, which is the worst geopolitical outcome that we can imagine. We've essentially fueled the creation of BRICS, where 40 nations are now threatening to get off of the dollar as the world reserve currency. If that continues, then that will make the Great Depression look like a cakewalk for us. But the Russians also, most importantly, have more nukes than we do. They have at least 1,000 more nuclear weapons than we do, and many people argue that their weapons are much better than ours. That they have anti-ballistic weapons that actually work, that will stop incoming missiles from hitting Russia, and that ours are much inferior. So why are we provoking a war with a nuclear superpower? Why are we settling this from the beginning?
This will be the last question.
Do you think that E-15 ethanol blend should be allowed to be sold year long?
What?
E-15 ethanol blend, do you think that should be allowed to be sold year long?
Oh, I have to look at that.
Okay, one more question.
Mr. Kennedy, what are your thoughts on the DNC not hosting a debate between you?
On the what?
What are your thoughts on the DNC not hosting a debate?
I'm the president.
What's DNC not hosting a debate?
Well, like I said, I think we're living in a period of our history, and it's really important to convince the American public that the system is not rigged against them, that we have a real democracy in our country. And part of having a democracy is that the public actually, the rank and file of the Democratic Party, the public gets to pick the candidate. It's not picked by the party like they did in the Soviet Union. It should be picked by the people. And they're not, the best way to pick them is to have debates, to have town halls, to do retail politics, to come out to places like this, to face the press, to face the public. Because otherwise, we have politicians who are living inside of a bubble. And the only people they're talking to are the billionaires who are writing them checks. And we need people. I see what's happening in the American heartland. I see the desperation, the mental illness that we've never seen anything like this before, the epidemics of opioids firsthand, the epidemics of alcoholism, of depression, of drug abuse, of the use of, the absolute use of SSRIs, and the debt, this extraordinary debt that Americans are being crushed by. And if you're not actually talking to people, going to kitchen tables, and talking to them, it's very easy for politicians to sit in a big mansion in Washington, D.C. and forget about the rest of the country. And I don't think that's good for our democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Thanks to all of you for being here. For information, Kennedy.